Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see your faces. We're hoping the confusion about the program is going to get sorted out and we'll have some people sauntering in, but I thought we should get started. Just to begin with, I am not Karen Barkey. As your program indicates, I am instead Allison Stenger. I am Leng Professor of International Politics and Economics at Middlebury College. I'm an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute and member of their science board. I'm a research affiliate at Stanford University, and last but not least, I'm senior advisor to the Hannah Arendt Humanities Network. So not Karen Barkey. Karen Barkey is great. I wish she were here, and I wish you could hear her, but we'll save that for another time. I don't want to belabor what's in your program, but we're very delighted to have with us here today Professor Tracy M. Strong, who's going to speak on the topic of learning our native tongue, America as a Project. Professor Strong has written many important books and has taught at very prestigious places. I learned from meeting him here yesterday that he was a student of Judith Shklar and Stanley Hoffman at Harvard University, where I was a student of the same, which was kind of a nice coincidence that we're on the same panel. And he is currently at the University of Southampton in the UK, Professor Emeritus of Political Philosophy and Political Science, too, in your title?
It's political theory, and when I say philosophy, that's cheating. It's actually political philosophy.
Okay, he's political theory and political philosophy, but his Ph.D. is in government. But he's Professor Emeritus at the University of California, San Diego. So just please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tracy Strong. We're delighted.
Thank you, Allison. It was actually a pleasure last night discovering that we shared so much genealogy together and could tell the same stories about the same people who taught us. Many thanks here to Roger Berkowitz, many thanks to Leon Botstein in absentia for conceiving of this conference, and many thanks, which I think I'm the first person to do this, to Christine Gonzalez Stanton, who made the arrangements and in my particular case suffered long in doing them. I have three claims. The first is a general claim, and is that any revitalization of any given democracy must or will have to draw upon the spirit, the Geist, the Esprit, Nietzsche, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, of that particular country. My second, more restricted claim is that the experiences of Americans over their history might themselves provide the bases for a revitalization of our American democracy. Notice, by the way, that I'm using the word American a lot. We've been, I think, less than country-specific here, even though we've talked about countries. It is the case we might provide the basis for revitalization. It is the case that our historical oblivion is such that these particular bases are mostly ignored. However, at various moments in our history, they have been available, only generally to be swept under by contingencies and what used to be called the interests. And lastly, because of this, America has always been a project. As Langston Hughes wrote in 1938, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never yet has been, and yet must be, the land where everyone is free. We must take back our land again, America." Now, my title is from a late poem of Robert Frost, which I'm going to leave for you to read there, but you can see learning has been part of their religion, and it'll be up for just a little while here. From this, I have three themes. First, that American democracy, as a project always needing to be realized, is what Sheldon Wolin called fugitive. Our crisis is not the crisis of democracy, it's the crisis of the project. Secondly, that what being a citizen entails passes from something individually acquired to something collective. And third theme, that when thought of as collective, citizenship often comes to be thought as something that can be given as a non-merited right. Now, what it means to be a citizen can be lost. Losing track of oneself as a citizen has a history as old as political thought. Take the opening of Socrates' speech in the Apology, his defense. Socrates, these are the first lines. How you, O men of Athens, have been affected by my accusers, I do not know. But I, for my part, almost forgot my own identity. So persuasively did they talk, and yet there is hardly a word of truth in what they have said. Socrates, at the beginning of political thinking, finds that he's in danger of losing track of what actually being a citizen, being an Athenian citizen, means. And from whence might he recall himself? This problem of recollection is our problem, and I think there are three stages to our situation. The starting point is to understand that Americans, even before there was a United States, the term American is first used in 1848, Americans have always struggled over what constituted the adequate signs of the qualities necessary to entitle one to be called a citizen and call oneself a citizen, that is, for electing and being elected. Citizenship is thus originally not primarily understood as a right, but as the acquiring of certain publicly recognizable virtues that permit one to act and be recognized as a citizen. It is not originally a right in that sense. For John Winthrop and John Cotton, these signs, these criteria, were Christian virtue, as manifest in and entailed by what were the relatively relaxed requirements of church membership, which was a position, by the way, that was challenged by Roger Williams. And if you are a Democrat, I would argue you should prefer Winthrop to Williams. Admission to church membership, thus, the criteria were not severe, was the sign that one was a responsible enough person to be entrusted with the serious business of the political realm. Now, this notion of the visible signs of virtue, of purity, they were the Puritans after all, is necessarily altered as time passes. First, during the First Great Awakening, 1730s and 40s, and in particular by the work of ministers like the theologian scientist Jonathan Edwards, later president of Princeton, Samuel Davies, and others. Edwards and the others recognized and saw the need to deal with the disappearance of the original purity, which was a criteria for citizenship, of the original purity that had led Englishmen to leave their home and come across the sea. And here, it's worth noting that this loss of original motivating virtue is identified not only by Edwards, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God is his great sermon, but it's recalled a century later by Hawthorne in The Scarlet Letter. Scarlet Letter is set in the 1640s, and at one point in the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne notes that the Puritan children, that is not the original generation, but the generation which did not have that original purity, the Puritan children amuse themselves by, and I'm quoting, scourging Quakers, taking scalps from Indians, scaring one another with freaks of imitative witchcraft, and finally by playing at going to church. As Puritan purity was fast fading, the revivalists thought to awaken an intense positive fear-based emotion towards virtue so as to revitalize the saliency of church membership, sinners in the hand of an angry God. In the border states, such congregations came to include African Americans, women, Whitefield opened his meetings to all, first step towards universalism. By the way, there were in these meetings no pews reserved to the rich. And the country grows. The white population in 1650 is about 50,000. By 1770, it's over 2 million. The intensity of emotion, which Edwards and the others demanded, proved difficult to require. In fact, several citizens of Northampton committed suicide in despair. Edwards was fired from his pulpit. A new grounding for citizenship comes in what one might call Gentry Republicanism, as exemplified at James Madison's early requirement of land ownership for active citizenship. You have his estate down there. It's not completely visible here, but you can see him. This is the requirement of land ownership is not so much the manifestation of an ideology favoring the rich, though it had that effect, as it was the claim that land ownership gave those owners a responsible stake in their country, and thus made for virtue and reduced the possibility of corruption. Such a view, however, was inadequate to deal with the increasingly large number of unpropertied but literate and self-sufficient urban artisans. Literacy in New England by 1780 is about 90%. Think of someone like Paul Revere, who you have his silver work up there at the top. Accordingly, to deal with this new issue, these new urban artisans, the achievement of Thomas Paine, cartoon there, was to argue that the possession of tools was a sufficient sign for the possibility of virtuous citizenship. We may call this democratic republicanism. Producing the means of one's life by one's own hands becomes the criterion for participation. And the country continues to grow. You have statistics. 1850, 24 million, an increase of 1/3 from only 1840. And this vision of citizenship is again modified by the Second Great Awakening, and most importantly by Lincoln. Lincoln gives wonderfully a great speech to the Temperance Union. He's quite young at that point. And he makes an argument against alcohol. You might expect. Temperance Union. What's the argument against alcohol? It's not that booze is a sin. He thinks it's stupid to argue that. He says the problem with alcohol is it makes you lose control. And if you lose control, you're a bad citizen. Lincoln's support of the Free Soil movement rests on a vision of the self-controlled, independent, and responsible citizen. To be self-controlled is not to be dependent, is not to be a slave. This is a quote from an essay of Lincoln's I'm about to talk about. In 1838, he gives a lecture entitled The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. And what he notes there, it's the same problem we've been pursuing. The revolutionary generation had what Lincoln called a living history, which informed them politically. You knew someone you had fought. You knew someone who had fought. You knew someone who was wounded. There were marks on you which provided a touchstone for your sense of who you were as a citizen. A living history. But with time, this has faded, and Lincoln wants to seek to replace it with a new living history. I'm quoting here. They were the pillars of the Temple of Liberty, and now that they have crumbled away, that temple must fall unless we, their descendants, supply their places with other pillars. It's a brilliant understanding, but it's one that's going to suffer under the economic development of capitalism post-Civil War. It is, however, this understanding of Lincoln, self-controlled and responsible, that is relevant to a correct understanding of his hostility to slavery. Lincoln argued that owning slaves made one slavish, a thought, by the way, already found in Rousseau. Always there was a fear of slavery, and not only the question of chattel slavery. Take an aside here, to defend chattel slavery, because it was an institution obviously in the South, it is ironically in the name of Republican virtue that Southerners like Calhoun and Fitzhugh argued that citizenship depends on the institution of chattel slavery, because it's the only way for the polity to deal adequately with those whom they think cannot be independent. That is, cannot meet the criteria for virtuous citizenship. And this, of course, were the slaves. They're like children. The black population of the United States in 1860 is almost 4.5 million, of which 4 million are enslaved. The Southerners in this context point to the advantages of the system they call Christian trusteeship, taking care of the children, as it were. The advantages of that system over wage slavery, notice the slavery metaphor again, that they find in the North. This is not centrally an economic argument, it's a criterion argument, though others did make, one has to say, the economic argument. Now, slavery is in fact the predominant metaphor for all that is not of the citizen. The fear of slavery arises in other realms, particularly in the nascent feminist movement. Marriage is proclaimed to be slavery. After all, you can't get out of it once you're in it, and so forth. So there's a lot of argument in favor of divorce in the feminist movement. The feminist movement is important, by the way, not only because it's often associated with the abolitionists, but even more because it provided training in public leadership to a wide range of middle and upper middle class white women, thus preparing an expectation of participation, which, by the way, of course, will only be realized in 1919 by a margin of 1 vote in the State House of Tennessee. It's important to note here, though, that these Lincolnian criteria of citizenship, free, independent, able to enjoy the fruits of your own labor, were shared by the newly freed blacks who claimed citizenship on the same individual grounds that had Lincoln and the others. And there's an interesting historical fact generally not known. After the Civil War, General Sherman, who was a racist but hated rebels more than he hated blacks, Sherman had given 400,000 acres of good land to newly freed blacks. The Congress had ratified his grant, but Andrew Johnson, now president, backed inter alia by the New York Times and Northern forces, vetoed it. And there's a set of extraordinary documents in which the blacks petition again and again and again not to have their land taken away from them. And the argument they make for retaining their land is that they worked it. Everything that was produced, they produced. And they are, this is Lincolnian, entitled to the fruits of their own labors, and no one can take it, should be able to take those away from them. There's a number of excellent books, if you're interested here, Ira Berlin, Steve Hahn, Alex Gurovich, and so forth. However, blacks and women are non-enfranchised. They're not, this is right at the end of the war, not fully citizens, they're groups. And a major politically important consequence of the Civil War is that it raises the question of the collective attainment of citizenship, as will eventually the feminist movement. So, I mean, in other words, you now all of a sudden have, after the Civil War, a large number of newly freed individuals from slavery. What are we going to do with them? And the answer to that, of course, is the 14th Amendment. Not so much the 13th, which abolished slavery, though that was important. But the 14th Amendment does something new, and it's important to realize what it does. 14th Amendment gives voting citizenship to blacks and to all who have been born in the United States. Citizenship here is now a collective grant, not an individually achieved situation. There's a complex and to our day unresolved tension between the bright individualism implicit in Lincoln's thought and the recognition that some problems can only admit of collective solutions. And if you read the work of James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, you'll find that they're very clear about this. But with this, we're moving into the post-Civil War, the last third of the century. And it's an area, and here I can't develop the argument, but I think in some sense the vision of citizenship, which has evolved, reinforces this. It's an era of unprecedented concentrated wealth and power, of unprecedented inequalities. I missed this thing. This is just to show you, this is the monument on Boston Common, the great poem by Robert Lowell for the Union Dead. You may have seen the film Glory, which is what this represents. At the dedication, William James could almost hear the bronze Negroes breathe. Their monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat. It's a glorious poem, and picks up the whole story of Shaw and his Black Regiment. We're into the Gilded Age here, this age of inequalities. And here's the voting that I was referring to before, with a reminder down at the bottom there of the fact of segregation that continues and so forth. But the inequalities are great and manifest, and they are resisted across the board by the lower classes and working classes. Cartoons like this one, Standard Oil monopoly with its tentacles out, or this one, the fat cats of the trust sitting behind the congressman whom they own and whom they control. These are many of these. One of my favorites, this one here, in a journal called Puck, which was published in both German and English. The snake of monopoly with its coils around the Capitol, threatening liberty and so forth. And the little Puck over there on the side saying to Uncle Sam, well, what are you going to do about it? This kind of resistance, this kind of movement is extremely widespread, and it manifests itself again and again and again. Now, prior to the Civil War, the United States was at most only partly a capitalist nation. Economic changes had produced these unprecedented concentrations of wealth, completely unregulated, by the way. A number of movements did grow up in response. They are individually focused, economically radical. We're thinking of the Knights of Labor, the Grange, the Greenbackers, and others. And most important will eventually become two groups, the populists and the socialists. Two figures here, William Jennings Bryan over there on one side, across a great cross of gold speech, and then Debs, Eugene Victor Debs, the socialist who grasped the dangers of concentrated corporate capitalism for citizenship. There's a wonderful story where Debs was giving a speech to a group of workers in Pennsylvania who were mostly Polish, and the journalist went up to one of them and found that this worker spoke no English, but he was crying with Debs's speech, and asked him, I know this must have spoken Polish or something, how come you're crying if you don't speak English? The answer was, he spoke to us with his hands, and we understood. But despite, and you can see that, Debs, by the way, was eventually put into prison over World War I resistance, and while in prison still received 6% of the vote for presidency. Debs, however, the populists, for a variety of reasons, fail. For the socialists, fail in the end to become a viable political party, never getting more than about 6 to 7% of the vote, though electing a number of local figures. And why? What's the problem? Well, there are four matters that come together here. One is the defeat of populism and the failure of Debs, as just mentioned. The second, all of these need to be detailed, but you have to know that they're there. The rise and fall of the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, who have an extraordinarily good economic analysis, but fail to develop a political program that goes with it. The third, and most important in some sense, is that the practice of politics changes It is no longer an amateur sport, one might say, but it becomes a professional sport. When Lincoln ran for the House in the 1850, he said he would stay but one term. This is a kind of, it's not sortition, but it's a kind of mini sortition. The idea was, I'm going to go to Washington for a while, and then I'm going to come back and be with you, citizen at home, a regular person. Footnote here. I think in almost all of the cases that have been presented here, people have failed to notice that there's a serious difference between those cases and the Greek situation in Athens. In Athens, there was sortition. You were chosen by lot, but you were chosen by lot to be a member of the boule, of the consul. So the whole set of issues that was raised this morning about, well, how do you institutionalize it, was not a problem in Athens. You had the institution. You were chosen to the institution. But in any case, Lincoln says he'll stay but only but one term. But until about 1910, the average tenure of a House of Representatives member is 1.5 terms. By the time you get to the middle 20s, it's 10 years, 5 terms. Re-election rates are 84%. Being in politics is now a job. Having a job, you need to retain that job. You don't want to be fired. That means you've got to get re-elected, and you can follow that logic out. We see it today all the time. That's a major transformation in the way politics and citizenship works in the States, and it affects the whole question of sortition enormously directly. The fourth matter that matters is an important but little remembered paradigmatic incident in American politics, which is the 1919 Seattle General Strike, during which, on their own, Seattle workers went on a general strike and ran the city for 5 days. Meals, hospitals, fire, feeding the children, delivering the milk, and so forth. The mainstream press called it a revolution and explicitly associated it with the new Bolshevik USSR. Things eventually petered out, and what's important here is not only this action, which is in fact, the people rising up, but in fact, its failure, because what were the lessons that were drawn from that failure? It is precisely at this time, we're in 1919, that the Bolsheviks had apparently successfully consolidated their revolution. The model of the Russian Revolution is of signal importance, thus, to a wide group of Americans. We screwed up, we didn't succeed, how come those guys did it right? And eventually, the Communist Party will provide a kind of direction for much on the left, not always completely taken up, but a direction as to what one has to do in order to actually succeed. Ellen Schechter has written a fine book arguing that by the time you get to the 1930s, the Communist Party of the United States is the most progressive political movement in the country. Now, this leads us to a whole other set of issues, because you're in the 20th century now, and the United States is moving into being part of a wider world in a much more extensive manner than it had before. And despite initial widespread opposition, America was drawn or pushed by Woodrow Wilson into the Great War, and to an increasingly important degree, the U.S. is involved with the rest of the world. And as I said before, the Bolshevik Revolution had triumphed against all expectations, maintained power. And in America at this particular point, this is the end of the First World War and just after, economic, social, and political pressures abound. By 1922, 20% of the workforce had gone on strike in 3,360 strikes. And two lessons were drawn by Americans from the failures of the end of the 19th century. How do we deal with this labor unrest? How do we deal with the attractions of socialism? And there are two ways, 2.5 ways really, which is what followed. The first lesson is drawn by the progressivism and its advocacy of a country in which social and economic problems are to be solved professionally by people with knowledge, by experts operating in the name of the public interest. We're already a good distance here from Bryan's 1896, "The people have a right to make their own mistakes." It's actually an interesting thing. One of the things that happens during the pandemic, is happening with the pandemic, is that we are essentially, to a certain degree, abdicating decision to experts, which may be the right thing to do or not, but we're allowing them to make the decisions for us. We see at this period the development of the discipline of public administration. Never happened before. The first MBA program is established in 1908 and grows rapidly. And so you get this notion that somehow we're going to solve these problems, not by the citizens, but by experts figuring out how to do it. This is the time of Taylorism. This is the time of Woodrow Wilson advocating a scientific approach to government. That's what goes on. Related to this, and to some degree reinforcing it, is, oh, I forgot this. I want to show this one to you. It's actually, this goes back, this takes us back to Bryan. Over on the top, what is it, the top, the far side that way, you have the results of the 1896 election. Blue states voted for Bryan. That's the progressive vote. The red states voted for McKinley. That is the Republican or right-wing vote. When you get to 2012, look what's happened. The country has reversed itself. And it's a phenomenon which is worth thinking about and talking about. What used to be the most progressive part of the country in the 1890s suddenly now has become the least progressive part of the country. And by 2016, it's even, in fact, worse. So there's back to where I was before, sorry about that. Related development is the social gospel movement at the beginning of the 20th century. Progressive-minded Christians sought to make activity in this world the focus of reform activity. They're very concrete. They address specific problems: inequality, racism, slums, poor health conditions, child labor, and so forth. The argument was, Christians are not to wait for the second coming of Christ to redeem the world, but they're to go out and change it. Jesus would not return, they held, until social justice had been achieved by us on this earth. William Jennings Bryan, who we had before there, was closely affiliated with the movement, and it's worth noting that the most progressive elements of American populace around the turn of the 20th century were evangelical Christians. And there's a very interesting question: is what exactly has happened on this? Fine book recently, by the way, Tanya Luhrmann, When God Talks Back, studying evangelical Christians who are more complicated than most of us think. A second lesson, however, first lesson is progressivism, coupled with social gospel. Second lesson is drawn, and it shapes the progressive left. If events like those of the Seattle strike 1919 had gone nowhere, it must have been because those involved were, in terms of a famous editorial at the time, were proceeding to go we know not where. What was needed was some idea of where or what one should proceed to. And the success of the Leninist Party was of great importance. Against all odds, the Bolsheviks not only took but maintained power. What did they know? And accordingly, the American left, in the period 1921-45, must come to grips with the apparent success of the USSR. If you look, for instance, in 1937, The Nation magazine, published during the trials in Moscow, publishes a magazine saying, despite the trials, the Soviet Union remains the best hope for mankind. We forget how important that was. The most important element here to deal with the success of the USSR in America can be traced to changes in the American Communist Party, the CPUSA, which seeks, under the leadership of Earl Browder, to fully Americanize itself and to join a conflictual notion of social justice with being an American. In 1936, Browder, head of the American Communist Party, runs for president on the slogan, "Communism is 20th century Americanism." What do we have next? We don't want that one yet. Communism is 20th century Americanism. And the story here is extremely complicated. And to tell the whole story, you have to begin to intersect this part of the left with the various aspects of the New Deal, all of which focus upon the development of economic democracy as a prerequisite for vigorous citizenship. And there was resistance. Particular note here are two things. One is a domestic resistance. In 1944, Henry Wallace, who was vice president, is denied being reappointed as vice president to the re-election of Roosevelt, and we get Truman instead. Truman is anti-Russian and much more conservative and has no global sense about him really at all at that point. The second thing that happens is not domestic, it's international. American Communist Party had in 1940 dissolved itself and replaced itself by something called the Communist Political Association, a non-party organization of Americans which based itself on the working class. The Communist Political Association carries forward the traditions of Washington, Jefferson, Paine, Jackson, and Lincoln under the changing conditions of modern industrial society. Sounds like socialism with Chinese characteristics. It upholds the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution. These are communists. And its Bill of Rights and the achievements of American democracy against all the enemies of public liberties. This is what has happened, and they essentially are trying to turn themselves into a left-wing pressure group in favor of economic democracy. And if you look at the sorts of things they support during the 30s and so forth, from Spain to civil rights to the arts and so forth, it's very, very extensive. What happens, though, in 1945 is that the Russians get very distressed at this. And they get distressed because, on the one hand, Yugoslavia is going its own way, and on the other hand, more importantly, China, where the revolution is about to succeed, is going its own way, and it's not what Moscow's telling it to do. I can tell you stories about that at some length. And so there is published a letter by a man named Jacques Duclos attacking the American Communist Party, or rather attacking Browder, and accusing him of American exceptionalism, of ideological naivete, and about anything else one could fling at him. And what Browder wanted was, in fact, to pursue and support the policies which looked like they had been decided on between the great powers at Tehran. And the question after this Duclos letter is, can one be on the progressive left, perhaps a communist and still a full American citizen, fades into the partly killed off by the Russians, and then, of course, with the Cold War. The available political spectrum in the 1930s and early 40s is much wider than that of 20 years later, and that's an enormously important fact. And it's for naught. East-West situation is underdefined in 45, 46. The conceptualization that made the construction of the Cold War possible comes from Kennan's long telegram, which allows people to the policy planners to make sense of the confusions of Eastern Europe. That telegram becomes radicalized into a doctrine called NSC 68, which provides the basis for American foreign policy the next 25 or 30 years. In 1947, Congress is taken over by the Republicans, and a variety of domestic surveillance and loyalty testing programs, again, the contraction of the political sphere, are put into place that severely constrain political citizen activity and the vision of an independent citizenship. The loyalty board, McCarthyism, failure of Rawls's Progressive Party, jailing and arrests and jailings of the leadership of the Communist Party, the loss of China, apparent aggression that starts the Korean War, all these reinforce certain policies and attitudes and impede the possibility of a progressive notion of citizenship. A range of political paths that had been legitimately available to many up until the end of the Second War are now thought un-American, and you have a committee in Congress investigating that. We move into the 50s. We're going to a Cook's tour here. The rise in commercialism in the place of citizenship. A certain homogenization of the country. My term for this homogenization is clam roll. Why? With the resources that became available post-World War II, people began to buy cars. The interstate highway program shortly comes into being. This means all of a sudden you can drive 200, 300 miles a day. Now, if you live in Poughkeepsie and you can't drive 200 miles, you know where to go to eat. But you've driven 200 miles. How do you know what's a good restaurant? And the genius of Howard Johnson's was to build restaurants that served exactly the same thing all across the country. That's the clam roll. I love the clam rolls. The clam roll was the same in Ohio, was the same in Illinois, was the same in Indiana. You could depend upon it, the homogenization, as it were, of the country. Also, conformism, as we know. Conformism tends to be resisted, but most often non-politically, e.g. the beatniks. When the New Left begins to come out from the early civil rights movement and anti-communist movements among the students, by the way, talking about parallel policies, the idea in the New Left is that the universities are a parallel polis because the students in them don't owe anything, their job or anything like that, to anyone. But when the founding document of the Students for Democratic Society, the Port Huron Statement, turns out to be not really about politics or citizenship. It's about authenticity, about being yourself. There's very little on trade unions or political parties or anything like that. The document mentions not once, I believe, any of the things I've talked about in this talk, any of the resources that were available to it from American history. It's as if it's thought it had to start things all over again. They do not attempt to reinvent a wheel that already had been there. They think they're starting anew. There's a glimmer of public participatory hope eventually in the Great Society, which gets undone by local interests, and the disappearance of the public is increasingly done through social media. Now, I've basically done that, but let me tell you two things that could have happened. This is out of the 1944 State of the Union message, Roosevelt. We are to have a right, he says, to a useful and remunerative job. We have the right to earn enough to provide adequate food, etc. The right is of every farmer to raise and sell his products for a decent living, of every businessman to trade and buy without unfair competition, the right of every family to a decent home, to adequate medical care, think, 44, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, think again, the right to a good education. This is what Roosevelt wanted and would have pushed. Congress eventually gutted it. Second thing that could have happened, post-war in 45, the UAW had foregone strikes during the war, it was part of the CIO, and it entered into negotiation with the General Motors. UAW, automobile workers, wanted everything to be subject to collective bargaining, not just wages, but what products were made, how they were marketed, how they were priced. They wanted control over everything. They wanted what's called co-management. They wanted to control their own life and the product of their own labor. Charlie Wilson, who was head of GM, said this is an idea from east of the Rhine. Refused. And when the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, there's a clause in the Taft-Hartley Act that no union that did not certify that none of its leadership included, even down to the shop level, people who were CP or fellow travelers, no union who would not certify that would be able to engage in collective bargaining. Approximately 1/3 of the leadership of the CIO fell into that category. Note. CIO caved. Progressive elements of the Labor Party were eliminated. The labor movement were eliminated. CIO eventually joined the AFL, much more conservative, and it's the beginning of the death of unionism. Now, I started this talk with a reference to Socrates. In the Crito, the next dialogue, Socrates has been trying to explain to Crito why he doesn't really think he should flee, as Crito is urging him. He's being condemned to death. And he can't convince him by an argument, so he tells a story. It's a story of a dream, he says he had, where the laws and commonality, nomoi kaite koinon, if you like the Greek, come to speak to the jailed Socrates who awaits death as he's considering these urging to flee. And the nomoi, the laws, point out to him that all that he, Socrates, is shaped by being an Athenian citizen. He refuses to escape. And his understanding is this: you learn what it is to be a citizen of your own polity from that polity, even when or if others, how many others, have forgotten or repressed or denied it. I note that the signers of the Declaration pledged their willingness to die, as did the Puritans. It's explicit, we were willing to die, as did James Baldwin, as did Malcolm X. America has always been a project, now less and less realized perhaps over time. What we need to do to revitalize democracy in this country is to learn from and practice elements of that project. One can do worse here than to cite the encomium from Pindar's Second Pythian Ode, a phrase which Nietzsche took as his touchstone, if you'll excuse the Greek because it's nice. Genoi hoios esimathon translates as, having learned, become what you are. I thank you. There's a fuller story here today. In the book, I've tried to work this all out. And I might say, just including, that today is the birthday of two people who have helped shape my talk here. One is Friedrich Nietzsche, and the other is Michel Foucault. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. I'm trying to decide whether I should go stand up there or sit here. What do you think? Sit? I'll sit. All right. Well, you've given us a lot to chew on here, so it's quite a sweeping, wonderful, wonderful talk.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? And I thank you for it. And I have a whole series of questions about the history, the narrative you're presenting, because I agree with you that America has always been a project for which citizens are willing to die. You know, and you traced the evolution of understandings of citizenship over time. And I think they've obviously very much changed. I might quibble with you over some bumps in the road there. So let me just throw some stuff out there and you can respond.
Yes.
Yeah, now, and I'll say all this by prefacing it with, I am married to a refugee from communist Czechoslovakia. So I I have a degree in Soviet studies, so I spent time in communist Soviet Union and communist Czechoslovakia. So I may have kind of a jaded view of communism. And let me just point out a couple of points. First point, you said that in 1848, the term American was first used. 1648. Okay, good. Phew. I was worried about that because of Tocqueville.
James Gage, who writes a book called The Travels of British Americans.
Okay, great. I misheard you, so I'm glad.
I may have misspoken too.
Yeah.
Sixes look like eights, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So the crisis of I guess you're arguing that it's a crisis of the project currently, the American project now, not a crisis of democracy. No. And I wanted to no.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that. But maybe we just bracket that so I can make, I want to cluster some historical points,
okay,
and then come back to that question.
Point.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like this idea of the original notion of citizens being virtuous coming from the Puritans. Yeah. But that raises the really interesting question when you look at the history of exclusion of citizens in the United States, and you see women not getting the right to vote until the 20th century, yet culturally they're seen as the custodians of virtue. So how would you square that circle?
The question is, but women. I'm being heard, right? Women are virtuous, but it is private virtue. Their virtue is, in fact, to keep men behaving virtuously in public. Hence the prevalence of women, for instance, in the temperance movement, which is, don't let your man go out there and get smashed. He'll be a bad guy. But it's not a public sense of virtue. And Anne, what's her name? The Feminization of American Politics it's an old book by Anne. Damn, I can't blanking on her last name, but that's the difference. And it's also there's a lot of complexity here. Women have the right to vote, for instance, in New Jersey up until 1804, so that it changes back and forth. Alexander Kesar has published a book called The Right to Vote. And one of the things he shows in that book is that the United States is the only, should we call it, Western nation where the right to vote is smaller at the end of the 19th century than it was at the beginning. It's quite stunning. Yeah. Now, that's the women are tricky because there are places where women are saying, oh, well, they're citizens, of course, but they don't have the right to vote because having the right to vote requires this other set of criteria, this other quality, which women can't have. And there you get the sort of standard things. They should stay at home. They should raise children. It's all private. They are to be goody two-shoes, but they aren't to be out there in the great wide world. That changes. And the point I was making, though, is the important point about the abolitionists and the feminist movement is that women lead those movements, and they therefore are in public, and that's the beginning, really, of a development which I think eventually results in the 1919th Amendment making women citizens, giving women the right to vote, achieved, by the way, as I said, by a single vote majority in the House, in the Tennessee State House.
Yeah, correct. This is sort of an interesting question you might comment on more generally. This notion of virtue being something that's in the public domain only, is that distinction?
No, there's public and private.
Right, but is that distinction routinely made in political philosophy between a public realm and a private realm of virtue? I thought people were just either virtuous or not virtuous. Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
Yes.
It sounds
having a public concern is a particular kind of virtue. If you are a woman for a long time, if you are black and so forth, you can't have public concerns because you are deemed incapable of it.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at, isn't that sort of a subtext of belief rather than something that's stated explicitly?
Well, you can find it's in Rousseau, it's in Montesquieu, it's in, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of political theory which does it, as unfortunate as one knows, but it is something to which there are counter arguments or counter examples, more exactly, but they're normally phrased as examples. The closest one comes is the sort of aristocratic women probably in 18th century France, where you begin to get something closer to it. In the States, it just doesn't happen, as far as I can tell.
Except you have Tocqueville extolling America. You have Tocqueville extolling American women in particular.
Yes, they're very good people.
Just not good citizens.
No, they are citizens, but they can't vote. Tocqueville never said they should vote. Voting is seen as something. This is the point I'm trying to make overall. Voting for a long time, up to the 14th Amendment, is seen as something which requires that you manifest certain kinds of qualities of being. Some people or groups are deemed, this is sexism, but are deemed incapable of it, women, blacks, and so forth. The argument in the South is we can't give blacks the right to vote because they are children. We have to take care of them. Christian trusteeship, as Calhoun called it. That's the voting, that is the participation in the public, is separate from being a citizen. And what the 14th Amendment does is it merges those two, and that's how we still think of citizenship now. But it's a brand new idea in 1868. Or it's an idea which, shall we say, is fully institutionalized in 1868.
Yeah, this is getting very fascinating. You know, I don't know if you're equally fascinated. We can take another line if you like, but isn't citizenship equated with voting in Athens?
Not for women. Not for slaves.
But were they considered citizens?
Well, they are.
I don't think so.
They are. They are not. They are. To be an Athenian citizen at that point, you have to have an Athenian mother and an Athenian father. Therefore, women, Athenian mothers, are in some sense Athenian, and in that sense, you could say they are in some sense citizens. I'd have to check precisely what language is used for that, though. That's a good question.
Okay, let's. This is interesting. I want to push you a little bit, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. I have a lot of questions, but just one or two more. You spoke of the attractions of socialism in the U.S.
Yes.
and kind of presented it as a almost American feature.
Mm-hmm.
I would almost argue the exact opposite. That anti-communism is the
anti-communism doesn't start well, it starts shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution as an accusation, as a full-blown policy nationally. It's not until after the Second World War. But
Debs goes to prison for traitorous.
No, Debs goes to prison because he mentions something negative about the draft in one sentence of one speech in 17. Until the United States declared war upon Germany in 1917, the popular opinion was overwhelmingly against going to war.
Mm-hmm.
And socialism, you know, the argument you're making about socialism is a standard argument which has come down mainly from Europeans. Why is there no socialism in America? Well, there is an American kind of something called socialism, and if you look at the kinds of arguments which are made by the Knights of Labor or the Grange or the Greenbackers and so forth, they are in many ways, one would say, something akin to what we might call socialist. They don't call it that. Debs is the person who calls it that and declares himself a socialist after a particular set of developments. But it is socialism, shall we say, with American characteristics. That's where, by the way, this book by Alex Gorovich, which
Yeah.
pursues this.
son.
It's really very good.
Yeah.
But the difference that happens is, that I was trying to argue at least, is that when you get one forgets the enormous impact that the success of the Bolshevik Revolution had upon the progressive elements of the American polity. An awful lot of Americans in the late 20s and 30s, women including, there's a big book on women going over to the Soviet Union to find out what's going there and so forth, going on there. It has an enormous impact because damn thing seems to work. Now, whether or not it's actually working and what's going on and so forth is not there. You get complicated things which are who is going to oppose predatory capitalism? Mm-hmm. Well, it's not going to be the English, and it's not going to be the French, and it's not going to be the Americans. The only world force that's doing it seems to be the Soviets. At that point, you're not worried really about the kulaks. Well, I can talk more about the kulaks, but you're not worried about those things. You're worried about the fact these people say they are in favor of justice and social equality and so forth. And it's a great, strong example. That thing I quoted from the head of the editor of The Nation, Frida, blanking on her last name again, 1937, she's saying, Soviet Union remains mankind's best hope, despite the purge trials. Stunning document.
Yeah. Well, but you also have Debs making speeches where he's effectively traitorous, praising Russia as a superior model than the American model. And I guess my problem is this: how can you define something as an American when it's actually being peddled by a foreign power, and all the movements are receiving money from Moscow?
That is the problem which the American Party has to solve, and that's what Earl Browder is trying to solve. And the communism is 20th century Americanism. He got into a lot of trouble inside the party, I mean, partly because the party was run in a Leninist manner. He was able to impose himself. But people, we strongly resisted. And when, in fact, the Duclos letter came out, the party met 3 times. I actually have the documents of it because it was all, the party's headquarters were bugged and it was taken down by the FBI. So I have the FBI's bugging of the discussion what to do about the Duclos letter. And the terrible, he's at this point abolished the party as a party, turned it into a political association and so forth. The terrible thing is that everybody in the Central Committee capitulates, including Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I mean, they all toe Moscow's line, and it's a failure. Now, what would have happened if Truman had not been president? Would Moscow have responded differently? They're very worried about losing #1 status in the communist movement. They certainly don't mind losing Yugoslavia. They don't like it. They're very worried about China. Long stories there I can go into. I interviewed the person who's the head of propaganda in Yan'an, a member of the Chinese Central Committee in the 46s and 50s, Liu Dingyi. And he told me with a sort of slight smile in his eye, a sort of anger though in his eye, we did not get one bullet from the Russians. They didn't help us at all. I mean, he hated the Russians for their lack of support. The Russians tried, for instance, in 1947-48, to convince the Chinese communists to stop their advance at the Yangtze River and leave the rest of the country to the nationalists. Mao said bullshit. Other cute stories there, I was told that in Yan'an, at the time that the Central Committee of the Chinese Party was making important decisions, their radio link with Moscow would suddenly not work. So they would make the decision. But so they're very worried about the Chinese, and if they lose China as subordinate and use the United States as subordinate, they've lost the 2 major parties in the world. and therefore they've got to do something about it, and I think that's the source of the Duclos letter. And we know that there were conflicts, and you would know this better because of your studies, but there were conflicts inside the leadership of the Soviet Union as to how to respond to the Tehran declarations and how to respond to the proposal of coexistence and those kinds of things.
Yep. Most definitely, yes. I have 8. Okay, we definitely want to turn it over to the audience.
Oh,
we're getting
sorry.
we're getting down into the weeds here. Please help us come back up out of the weeds. Questions on American citizenship? Roger.
Thanks, Tracy. It does strike me that you've told a story that might be called the Jeffersonian story without mentioning Jefferson.
I mentioned him once.
You did mention, okay. I mean, but where's Hamilton in this story?
Oh,
and not just him, but like the urban story. I mean, this seems like a very agrarian American story, which, you know, has appeals on a lot of levels, but it seems to be focused on that. And maybe I'm wrong or missing something.
You want more? There's more. The one thing I did mention, however, here is that one of the things that happens over the course of time is that as conditions in the country change, expansion, sort of things like that, the criteria for that one has to meet to think of oneself as a citizen themselves change. And one of them, and I did mention this, is that with the suddenly very rapid growth in the major cities of literate artisans, but who are non-property, something's got to be done with them. And in fact, Paine is the person who, in fact, argues for, this is now urban, for this possession of tools as a basis of citizenship. And his argument is strong enough, and the realities of this changing demographic situation are salient enough that, in fact, Madison yields on the property question, at least in relation to the lower house. Now, in 1820, I think it was, he does write another article where he says, I really wish we could have property things for the upper house. And this is when, of course, the Senate is not elected in the way that it is now. And he's hoping for retain some kind of notion of property on the grounds that I said. That's quite true. But the Paine argument carries the day. And then you get this complex expansion, which is not fundamentally urban, but is which becomes free soil, which goes on for a while. I mean, Chicago's a tiny little town until sometime after the Civil War. But there's a danger of a certain amount of agrarianism. Now, Brian and the populists are often accused of being sort of, agrarian, goody-goodies. There are several books on the relation of populism to industrialization and the urban situation, which are pretty convincing that that's a great deal of an exaggeration. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that American history is often written as if somehow your Jeffersonian model were the only thing. There's a certain amount of literature that started coming out in the 60s, saying that's not really the case. Now, and then you get to books like David Montgomery's book, The Working Class and so forth, in the early 20th century, and that is, it's just gone. There's nothing of that there at that point. But we do retain a certain, being your own man, you think of a farmer first and not of a person working in a factory.
We've got a question right in the front row.
Hi. So my takeaway from your talk, which I really appreciated, is just simply reminding us of the labor history of the United States, and whether we call it communist or labor or social I mean, Kellogg's is on strike right now. Nurses are on strike right now. The sort of remaining elements of a union and labor movement in the U.S. is active. And I guess the question you asked was, who is going to take on predatory capitalism? And I think that is a question that I wonder if citizens' assemblies can address. Mm-hmm. Like, who is going to take them on? Are they going to take them on? Are they going to have the power? Because I think it's obviously a question that has to be addressed. And I think it's one that I know Kali talked about power and needing economic leverage. I think it's entered the space, but I feel like you've put the labor issue on the table.
Mm-hmm. The labor issue is absolutely on the table. By and large, our sense of what makes labor successful are labor unions. And we know what's happened to labor unions, which are now very small except in certain parts of the public sector. The number of strikes during the 1950s goes way down, and they're very quickly dealt with, partly because there's legislation which allows them to be squashed and so forth. There are interesting things being thought about. I have a colleague who's just written a very interesting article at what he calls just riots. Now, we are back to problems we had before today, which is, okay, you have a riot and so forth. What's the institutionalization? That doesn't happen. I have a graduate student who wrote about the demonstrations in Seattle over 7 or 8 years ago as an example of representation, as a new form of representation. But again, you have the problem of, nobody remembers those now, and it's unclear. I don't know what it's like in Seattle. The general strike in Seattle lingered as a touchstone memory for some considerable period of time, and there's still a lot of people who are concerned with it there. It's actually an extraordinary event in American history. But there's a question which I don't know the answer to, which is, what is the relationship between the kind of thing that you're talking about and the existence of social media? And I just don't know how that's going to work. And there are times when I'm relatively convinced that social media, in fact, as Sherry Turkle wrote, makes us alone together. But there's also a way, clearly, in which social media can connect people to each other. I do know that in China, the existence of cell phones has produced, at certain times, an interesting kind of local pressure upon the central power. It gets coordinated, however. It's not coordinated here, or it's coordinated in various groups, most of which I'm not part of and we aren't part of. I don't know how to solve that, but those are the issues that need to be thought through. And I think the social media question is absolutely key. The last chapter of this book, which I shamelessly have put up there, it actually goes into the question of social media and what it does in terms of a sense of the public, because it's whatever kind of public it is, it's a different kind of public than the kind I'm talking about in the rest of the talk. Okay.
We are unfortunately out of time, but yeah, please join me in thanking Professor Strong for a stimulating talk. Hello. I'd now like to invite our next panel to please come forward, David and the others.